Soft ambient sound drifts in, a slow, steady heartbeat, a distant hum, like wind moving through an empty hallway. Close your eyes. Imagine the mind is a silent room filled with unopened doors. Doors to memories, to buried desires, to the quiet shadows we rarely dare to face. More than a century ago, there was a man who stepped toward those doors without fear. A thinker who believed that dreams carried a secret language, and that every night, the mind whispered truths we could not speak by day. Tonight, we follow his footsteps. We walk gently into that hidden landscape, into the soft, symbolic world where thoughts become images and wishes become stories. This is a journey into the unseen, into the whispered poetry of the unconscious, the place where Freud believed every dream begins. At the turn of the 20th century, Vienna lay beneath a soft veil of winter light, a city that glowed quietly at night under the warm flicker of gas lamps. Snow powdered the cobblestone streets like a thin layer of dream dust, settling on horse-drawn carriages and the tall collars of men walking home late from cafes where ideas were exchanged as eagerly as cups of dark coffee. The world moved more slowly then. Footsteps echoed longer. Conversations lingered in the cold air, hanging like faint clouds of breath. And inside the amber glow of windows, one could see silhouettes bent over books and manuscripts, their faces lit by candlelight that trembled gently with every draft. This was Vienna at its most restless, yet most luminous. A city alive with thinking. Artists, writers, musicians, scientists, and philosophers mingled in its coffee houses, creating a quiet storm of innovation beneath an otherwise polite and ordered society. It was a place where classical music drifted out of opera houses while radical new ideas simmered in private salons. A place where tradition stood proudly on marble floors, yet modernity whispered provocatively just over its shoulder, urging it to turn and look. Into this world walked Sigmund Freud. He belonged to Vienna as much as Vienna belonged to him. It was the city that shaped his ambitions, his anxieties, and eventually the theories that would reshape humanity's understanding of itself. But before Freud became Freud, he was simply a young man captivated by the mysteries of the mind at a time when Vienna was becoming the intellectual crossroads of Europe. To understand Freud, you must first feel this city, not as a historian, but as a quiet observer standing in the falling snow, watching the lights of a distant streetcar blur into gentle streaks. Vienna was not just a place. It was an atmosphere, a mood, a kind of quiet hum beneath daily life. It thrived on dualities, elegance and decay, rationality and superstition, the old empire and the new century pressing in through cracks in the walls. Inside certain aristocratic homes, seances were held under crystal chandeliers. Mediums whispered to the dead while just a few streets away. Physicists debated the nature of energy and matter. Doctors performed meticulous dissections in medical schools while fortune tellers read palms near the opera house. It was this strange coexistence of science and mysticism, logic and longing, that permeated the city's air, and Freud absorbed all of it. By day, he studied neurology with fierce intensity, peering through microscopes, tracing the fine threads of the nervous system as if they were trails leading deeper into the human interior. He believed, at least in those early years, that every secret of the mind could be explained by physical structures, neurons, fibers, chemical impulses. If he looked closely enough, he thought he might find the mechanical source of thought itself. But Vienna held more than scientific clarity. It was also filled with illusions, performances, and riddles of the human soul. Freud often walked past the theaters on his way home, past posters advertising psychological dramas and tragic operas where passion spilled dramatically across the stage. Even these influenced him. He felt instinctively that the human mind was not merely a biological machine but a place of stories, conflicts, symbols, desires that played out behind the curtain of consciousness. Vienna, with its contradictions, taught him that both worlds were true, the measurable and the mysterious. As he moved through the streets, Freud carried his fascination with him like a quiet ember. He visited libraries where candlelight flickered against the spines of heavy volumes on neuroanatomy, hypnosis, and obscure medical cases. He absorbed everything he could about disorders of memory, perception, and dreams. Even as he studied the physical structure of the brain, he became increasingly drawn to the invisible architecture of thought, the forces shaping behavior beneath awareness, the emotions that echoed long after events had passed. At the same time, Vienna society itself was becoming an elaborate mask, outwardly proper, inwardly pressured. Many people carried unspoken fears, desires, and conflicts behind carefully crafted manners. Freud saw in everyday interactions small slips, involuntary gestures, moments when the mask cracked. He began to wonder, what if these cracks were clues? What if they revealed a hidden world beneath the surface, an unconscious realm where the truth lived quietly? Vienna inspired these questions. The city was full of them. In the cafes, heated debates unfolded over art, science, and philosophy. Some argued that humanity was reaching an age of pure rationality. That reason would soon explain everything. Others insisted there were realms of experience, dreams, intuition, imagination, that would forever escape strict scientific boundaries. Freud often sat at the edge of these conversations, listening more than he spoke. He sensed that the truth was not in choosing one side or the other, but in understanding the tension between them. And so, like the city itself, Freud existed in a state of balance between opposites. He respected science deeply, grounding his early career in neurobiology and pathology. Yet he could not ignore what science, at that time, refused to touch: the intangible depths of emotion, the symbolic language of dreams, the strange logic of the mind when it speaks without words. It was no coincidence that in this period, Freud's interest began to shift. While other physicians focused strictly on physical symptoms, he became fascinated with what could not be seen under a microscope. Hysteria, phobias, obsessions, slips of the tongue, all these phenomena suggested a hidden force shaping human behavior. Vienna, with its mixture of spectacle and secrecy, encouraged him to look beyond the obvious. In quiet moments, as snow fell outside his study, Freud read works of philosophy and literature that explored the inner life: Goethe, Schopenhauer, and later Nietzsche. Their words blended with the murmuring intellectual currents of the city, weaving a tapestry of influences that nudged Freud toward a revolutionary idea that the mind was not transparent to itself. That beneath the surface thoughts we speak openly lies another layer, deeper and far more powerful. This insight did not come all at once. It grew slowly, like frost spreading across a window pane, forming patterns that only become clear when the light hits them at just the right angle. And Vienna provided that angle. Every conversation, every lecture, every observation of its people helped crystallize the thought that consciousness was only a small island floating above a vast and unseen sea. In this sense, Freud's world was preparing him, subtly, quietly, for the breakthrough that would change the way people understood themselves. He did not yet have the language of the unconscious, nor the theories that would later define him, but the seeds were there, nurtured by a city where the rational and the mystical coexisted in delicate tension. Vienna at the turn of the century was not just the backdrop of Freud's life. It was the living, breathing context that shaped his imagination. Its gaslit streets, its blend of scientific ambition and spiritual curiosity, its air thick with questions. These were the elements that guided Freud toward the hidden world he would eventually reveal. And so, as we walk through these quiet, snow-dusted streets, guided by soft light and gentle footsteps, we begin to see the world Freud saw. A world where every shadow suggested a deeper story, where every silence hinted at something unspoken, and where the mind, far from being a simple instrument, was a labyrinth waiting to be explored. It was here, in this luminous tension between logic and the unknown, that Sigmund Freud began his journey into the secret language of the mind. Long before Sigmund Freud became the interpreter of dreams and the cartographer of the unconscious, he was simply a small boy living at the edge of an empire, surrounded by family, shadows, and questions he did not yet have the language to ask. He was born in 1856 in the quiet town of Freiburg, a place of narrow streets, small houses, and the slow rhythms of provincial life. His earliest memories, though never recorded in detail, would have been shaped by this gentle rural landscape, the hush of forests, the creak of wooden carts, the comfort of a close-knit family living modestly but with hope. Freud was the first child of his mother, Amalia, and from the moment he entered the world, she adored him with a warmth that he would later recall as one of the great emotional certainties of his life. She called him Mein goldener Sigi, my golden Siggy. Such a simple phrase, spoken in the soft German of a devoted mother, planted in the child a deep sense of being beloved, chosen, destined for something extraordinary. Amalia believed he was special, and that belief surrounded him like a gentle halo. But the household was more complicated than a simple picture of early affection. Freud's father, Jacob, was older, 40 years old when Freud was born, and carried the weight of experience, hardship, and disappointments that had shaped his own character. Jacob was intelligent, disciplined, and proud, but he was also marked by the realities of his time: economic struggle, cultural prejudice, the responsibilities of providing for a growing family. He loved his children, but his love was firm, structured, and often shadowed by the burdens he carried. Freud respected and feared him in equal measure. This mixture, the mother's warmth and the father's authority, created the emotional landscape of Freud's earliest years. It is a landscape that would, decades later, echo through his theories. The Oedipus complex, the dynamics of desire and rivalry, the psychological weight of parental figures. These ideas would emerge from a mind shaped not by abstraction, but by lived experience. Before he analyzed other families, Freud had already lived inside one rich with contrasts: tenderness and sternness, security and anxiety, admiration and intimidation. The seeds of psychoanalysis were planted long before the word existed. When Freud was just 3 or 4 years old, his family left Freiburg and moved to Vienna, a decision driven by financial pressures and the hope of greater opportunity. For a young child, such a relocation was a rupture, leaving behind the familiar rhythms of small-town life for the bustling, crowded, multicultural capital of the Austro-Hungarian Empire. Vienna was louder, larger, filled with new faces and strange voices. But it was also a city that rewarded intelligence and ambition, and from the moment Freud began school, it became clear that he possessed both in abundance. He excelled academically, not simply because he worked hard, though he did, but because he was profoundly curious. He devoured books with a hunger close to reverence. He learned languages as though they were keys to hidden rooms. He watched people carefully, not out of suspicion, but out of a deep intuitive interest in the way they moved, spoke, and reacted. Even as a boy, Freud was quietly studying the human mind long before he would understand that this was his calling. The Freud household was modest but intellectually alive. Jacob encouraged rigorous thinking and debate. Amalia nourished emotional warmth, and Freud's siblings added their own complexities to his early emotional world. Being the eldest son of his mother, Freud felt a weight of expectation, gentle but undeniable. He sensed that his success would be a kind of redemption for the struggles his family had endured. Even as a child, he felt responsible for something larger than himself, and that feeling shaped the seriousness that would define his personality. There were early shadows, too, experiences Freud rarely spoke of openly, yet which subtly influenced his later thinking. One memory he would recount as an adult involved seeing his young brother die unexpectedly. The event left a trace of guilt and sadness in the child's mind, a whisper of the complex emotions that can reside beneath conscious awareness. Freud would later build an entire field of study around such whispers. There was also the moment when, as a boy, he witnessed his father being insulted by a stranger on the street. Jacob responded calmly, even passively, and the young Freud felt something shift inside him. He admired his father, yet here was a moment in which the man he looked up to seemed vulnerable, diminished. This memory would later become symbolic in Freud's imagination, a small wound that revealed a powerful truth: that authority figures are not invincible, and that children carry the emotional echoes of such realizations long into adulthood. These experiences were not dramatic in the way history tells stories. They were quiet, ordinary moments, so understated that they might have vanished completely had Freud not possessed a uniquely introspective mind. But for him, nothing in the emotional world was ever truly small. Even as a child, he sensed that the roots of human behavior were buried deep in early impressions, early loves, early fears. He felt the weight of moments that other people forgot. By the time Freud reached adolescence, he was already setting himself apart. He read voraciously: philosophy, poetry, literature, science. His teachers noted his seriousness, his discipline, his exceptional memory. His mother still called him her golden Siggy, and though he would grow into a man known for dissecting human desire with sharp intellect, he never fully escaped the emotional imprint of her devotion. Nor did he forget the stern shape of his father's authority. In many ways, Freud's early life was unremarkable. No great tragedies, no extraordinary events. And yet, from these quiet beginnings emerged one of the greatest revolutions in human thought. Freud would build psychoanalysis not on dramatic stories, but on the notion that the most powerful forces in our lives are often the smallest, the subtlest, the ones formed in the shadows of childhood. A glance, a word, a silence, a moment of affection, a moment of fear. He grew up believing that the human mind was not a blank slate but a layered landscape, each layer shaped by early experiences both tender and painful. And in that belief, one could hear the faint echoes of his own childhood, the warmth of a mother's smile, the gravity of a father's expectations, the feeling of being both loved deeply and watched closely. Freud would grow into a man who gave names to the invisible, who traced the roots of human behavior back to the beginnings of life itself. But the roots of his own journey were planted in those early years, in the small town of Freiburg, in the crowded streets of Vienna, and in the delicate interplay of love and authority within his family. Before he interpreted dreams, he lived inside them. Before he mapped the unconscious, he felt it. Before he studied minds, he sensed, quietly, intuitively, that the human soul was full of shadows waiting to be understood. And in this way, long before Sigmund Freud became the father of psychoanalysis, he was simply a child of many shadows, listening, wondering, absorbing the world through a mind already attuned to its hidden depths. By the late 19th century, Freud found himself standing at the threshold of a new frontier, one not marked on any map, one that no physician before him had dared to chart. It began quietly, not with grand theories or dramatic breakthroughs, but with a single patient whose suffering whispered to him in ways that textbooks could not explain. Her name was Bertha Pappenheim, known in the medical notes as Anna O. She was young, intelligent, sensitive, and tormented by strange symptoms. Paralysis that came and went, sudden blindness, muteness, compulsive behaviors, states of confusion that washed over her like a dark tide. Physicians of the time called it hysteria, a diagnosis as vague as the shadows that haunted her. But to Freud, and to his colleague Joseph Breuer, she seemed to be speaking a language no one yet understood. During her treatments, something remarkable happened, something that would change Freud's life, and through him, the inner lives of millions. When Anna began to speak freely about her fears, her memories, her dreams, and the emotions she had never given voice to, her symptoms softened, sometimes even vanished. These were not discussions of anatomy or nerves or the physical body. They were stories, fragments of buried experiences, long-suppressed grief, and secret desires. And as she spoke, as the hidden currents of her mind flowed into words, something inside her shifted. It was she who called it the talking cure. Later, half-jokingly, she named it chimney sweeping, as though the soot of unexpressed emotions could be cleared away simply by giving them voice. Freud never forgot this phrase. It seemed to capture something essential, that beneath the polished surface of consciousness lay a quiet accumulation of unsaid things, waiting to be released. In these early days, Freud began to observe a pattern. Patients who carried old traumas found relief in recounting them. Those who suffered from inexplicable fears or bodily symptoms often revealed, through speech, emotional wounds that had never fully healed. Words became bridges. They connected the past to the present, the hidden to the visible. Silences became maps. Moments when a patient hesitated, stuttered, or fell quiet pointed toward thoughts too painful or too forbidden to express openly. Dreams became messages. They arrived at night wrapped in strange images and symbols, yet held within them truths the waking mind could not bear. For Freud, this was not simply medicine, it was revelation. He began to question everything he had been taught, that the mind was rational, that symptoms were rooted solely in physical causes, that the brain could be understood like any other organ. But here, before him, were patients whose bodies obeyed the laws of unspoken emotions rather than physiology. A paralyzed arm that moved again when a repressed memory surfaced. A panic that dissolved once its forgotten trigger was recalled. A nightmare that disappeared when its secret meaning was understood. Each case taught Freud that the mind was not a transparent instrument, but a layered, dynamic realm where the unexpressed lived on in disguise. It was during this period that Freud developed what would become one of the core practices of psychoanalysis, free association. Instead of asking patients to answer questions or follow structured conversations, he encouraged them to say whatever came to mind, no matter how trivial, strange, or embarrassing. At first, many resisted. They tried to present coherent stories, tidy explanations. But Freud noticed that the true heart of their suffering emerged only when they let their thoughts wander freely, like leaves drifting on a river. Beneath this uncontrolled flow of words, he sensed a hidden logic, a chain of associations linking the present to the past, the conscious thought to the unconscious desire. The idea was radical, that the mind hid things from itself, that symptoms, tremors, obsessions, phobias, lapses in memory were not random, but stories, distorted and disguised. The body, in Freud's view, spoke the truths the conscious mind refused to hear. A cough might be the echo of an unspoken grief. A phobia might guard the entrance to a forbidden memory. A slip of the tongue might reveal a wish too uncomfortable for daylight. Freud followed these clues with quiet intensity. His patients, often lying on a couch while he listened from behind them, gradually revealed worlds beneath their words. Childhood memories resurfaced like fragments of a forgotten dream. Conflicts between desire and duty appeared in hesitant pauses. Painful truths emerged wrapped in symbols. And through it all, Freud listened, not as a scientist seeking measurable data, but as a kind of archaeologist of the soul, brushing away layers of dust to uncover emotional artifacts buried long ago. The stories were often painful, full of loneliness, lost love, longing, fear. Yet Freud approached them with empathy rather than judgment. He understood that every symptom was a form of communication, however disguised. Every conflict had once been an attempt to survive. Even the most troubling thoughts belonged to a mind trying, in its own way, to protect itself. This understanding shaped what would become the heart of psychoanalysis, the belief that healing begins when the unspoken becomes spoken, when the forgotten is remembered, when the symbolic is understood. Of course, these ideas were controversial. Many in the medical community dismissed Freud's theories as speculative, even dangerous. They preferred explanations grounded in anatomy, not emotion. But Freud could not turn away from what he had witnessed. The transformations he saw in his patients were undeniable, even if the theories behind them were still forming. He felt, with growing certainty, that he had opened a doorway into a realm where the mind communicated in symbols, metaphors, and hidden messages. And so, quietly, patiently, he continued listening. He listened to the rhythm of speech, to the tremble of a voice, to the sudden interruption of a sentence. He listened to dreams as though they were poems written by the unconscious, cryptic, fragmented, but deeply meaningful. He listened to the silence between words, trusting that the mind spoke through pause as much as through sound. And with each session, each revelation, psychoanalysis began to take shape, not as a strict method, but as a way of hearing. Freud believed that every human being carried within them an inner narrative, largely unknown to themselves. A story written in the earliest years, shaped by relationships, desires, fears, and conflicts too overwhelming for a child to understand. As adults, we lived out these stories without realizing it, repeating patterns, reenacting old dramas, following emotional paths laid long ago. To uncover these stories was, Freud felt, to return a person to themselves. And so the birth of psychoanalysis was not a single event but a gradual awakening. A discovery born not from experiments or machines, but from deep, attentive listening. From the belief that the human mind, even in its suffering, speaks with intelligence. That symptoms are not failures but messages. That the things we hide, our fears, our desires, our memories, continue to shape us until they are brought into the light. Freud would go on to build an entire psychological universe from these early insights. But it began here, in quiet rooms where patients spoke and he listened. In moments where a memory broke through like light through a crack. In the gentle realization that beneath every word lies another, deeper one. In this way, psychoanalysis was born, out of suffering, out of silence, out of stories waiting patiently to be told. In dreams, Freud believed he had discovered what he called the royal road to the unconscious, a quiet, moonlit corridor through which the deepest parts of the human mind whispered their truths, not in sentences but in images, not in logic but in symbols, and not in daylight clarity but in the shifting, poetic haze of sleep. To understand what happens in this mysterious landscape, he introduced the idea of dream work, the gentle, intricate process by which the mind transforms raw feeling into a nighttime story. At the surface lies what Freud called the manifest content, the visible storyline of the dream, the things we remember upon waking, wandering through a childhood home, speaking to someone long gone, running though unsure of what we're running from. But beneath this fragile surface lies the latent content, the true emotional core, shaped from the hidden wishes, fears, conflicts, and longings we cannot always speak aloud. The mind, Freud said, disguises this deeper content through symbolism, images that stand in for emotions, objects that hold entire histories, moments that condense years of memory. Dream symbols are not puzzles to be solved quickly, but delicate meanings to be approached with patience, like following a thin trail of ink as it slowly spreads across a page. And because of this symbolic nature, Freud believed the dream was nothing less than a poem the mind writes for itself each night, a piece of subconscious literature crafted in silence, structured from fragments of memory, desire, and imagination. As we drift into sleep, clouds seem to pass across an inner sky soft and weightless, carrying pieces of the day with them, Keys turn slowly in distant locks, hinting at doors we did not even realize were closed within us. Ink bleeds across paper, blooming into shapes we only half recognize. Forms that invite us to look closer, wonder deeper, and listen to the language beneath language. In this dream poem, nothing is random. A stranger's face might be the borrowed mask of an emotion we haven't processed. A familiar room might be a stage built from an old longing. An impossible event, a flight, a fall, a sudden transformation, might be the mind's delicate attempt to express something that ordinary speech would collapse under. Freud believed that dreams reveal hidden wishes, but he insisted that these wishes were not monstrous or wicked. Instead, they were deeply human, shaped by the universal desire to be safe, to be loved, to repair what is broken within us. Some dreams are the mind's attempt to return us to a moment of tenderness we fear we've lost forever. Others seek to rewrite a memory that still aches beneath the surface. Others gently release thoughts we have tried too hard to contain. And even nightmares, in Freud's view, were not punishments or threats but messages. Urgent, powerful attempts by the psyche to draw our attention to something we have neglected. A nightmare may startle us awake, but inside it lies the same quiet intention as in a peaceful dream. The mind trying to speak, trying to heal, trying to be heard. As the documentary slows, imagine the camera drifting through this dream realm with the same softness that the mind uses when touching its own wounds. The lens moves through clouds that shift like thoughts passing across consciousness, some bright, some dark, all temporary. It lingers on a key turning slowly in an ancient lock, a symbol of access, of permission, of the brave choice to open what has long been hidden. It watches ink spread across parchment, delicate and unstoppable, like feelings we can suppress during the day, but that return with honesty in the quiet hours of night. These metaphors, calm and steady, mirror the slow, almost tidal movement of dream work itself. Nothing rushed, nothing forced, everything unfolding in its own time. To Freud, the dream was never simply a neurological glitch or a meaningless flicker of imagination. It was a message system, a bridge between the conscious self and the vast, uncharted territory beneath. And though many have critiqued or revised his theories, the central metaphor remains powerful. Dreams as portals into the most truthful parts of ourselves. When he called dreams the royal road, he meant that they were a privileged path, a direct route into the intimate machinery of the psyche, its hopes, its conflicts, its quiet ache for resolution. In the darkness of sleep, we become both the storyteller and the listener, composing symbols with one part of the mind while another part watches with curiosity. What makes the dream so remarkable, Freud believed, is not merely what it reveals, but how gently it reveals it. We do not confront our truths head-on. We walk toward them in softened, symbolic form. A dream allows grief to wear the face of a stranger. It allows desire to speak through metaphor. It allows fear to become a shifting landscape we can navigate without breaking. And when we wake, confused, comforted, unsettled, or inspired, we carry with us the residue of these inner journeys, even if we cannot fully articulate them. It is as though the night has given us a message written in a language we almost understand, a language made not of grammar, but of emotion, memory, and metaphor. Freud's vision of dreams was ultimately compassionate. He believed the unconscious was not an enemy, but a storyteller trying to communicate with us. The wish revealed in a dream was not a dangerous indulgence, but a piece of the self-seeking expression. And so the dream became, for Freud, a form of nocturnal honesty, a place where the mind could speak freely, without judgment or interruption, telling us what we most need to hear in ways we might finally be able to accept. In the silent hours before dawn, when the world is dim and the mind is unguarded, we encounter ourselves in symbolic form, and the dream becomes not just a riddle, but a guide, not just a story, but a mirror, not just a fantasy, but a quiet revelation of everything most human within us. In Freud's imagination, the human mind was not a tidy cabinet of thoughts, but a vast inner landscape, layered, shifting, and alive, a place shaped by forces we feel more than we fully understand. To explore the unconscious is to drift beneath the visible surface of consciousness, descending into a realm where logic loosens and emotion becomes the quiet current guiding everything. Freud's map of the mind, the ID, the ego, the superego, was never meant to be a rigid scientific diagram. Instead, it was a poetic attempt to describe the invisible architecture of our inner life, a way of giving form to the subtle tensions that shape every choice, every impulse, every moment of internal conflict. To approach this landscape, the documentary invites the viewer to move slowly, calmly, as though walking through a dimly lit dream, listening to the soft echoes of thoughts we rarely pause to notice. The idea, Freud believed, lies deep below, like the restless tides pulled by a distant moon. It is ancient, instinctual, and wordless. It does not speak in reason but in urges, hunger, desire, fear, the longing to be comforted, the craving for warmth and safety. These tides rise and fall inside all of us, sometimes gently, sometimes with force, but always silently, shaping the emotional weather of our inner world. The idea is not dangerous. It is simply human, a reservoir of energy that keeps us alive, a reminder that beneath our layers of civility we are still creatures who feel deeply, instantly, intensely. In the documentary's visual language, these tides could glide across the screen as slow, luminous waves, cresting and dissolving under a moon that hangs low and patient over dark water, an image of the ancient rhythms that move through every mind. Above these tides sails the ego, the quiet ship that navigates the world of reality. It listens to the pull of the ID, but also to the rules and limits of the external world, adjusting its sails carefully, steering between what we want and what is possible. Freud saw the ego not as a stern commander, but as a gentle mediator, doing its best to create balance amid competing demands. It is the part of us that plans, chooses, hesitates, questions, and reassures. A ship, steady and humble, fits this metaphor. It moves not with force, but with attention. It studies the waters, senses the shifting wind, and keeps moving even when the route is unclear. Visually, this ego ship might drift through a soft gray sea at dawn, mist rising around it, the world quiet enough that every creak of the wood and every ripple in the water feels meaningful. The ego is our conscious self, but it is also a listener, listening to the sea below, the weather above, the murmur of the superego behind it. And the superego, in Freud's map, is like a whisper carried on the wind, faint echoes of old voices, inherited expectations, lessons learned in childhood, and the moral compass shaped by culture, family, and society. It does not shout. It murmurs. It reminds us who we were taught to be, what we were told was right, how we were asked to behave. Sometimes these whispers guide us with kindness. Sometimes they weigh heavily, like rules we carry long after we needed to. But they are part of our inner landscape, shaping our sense of responsibility, guilt, aspiration, and integrity. In imagery, the superego might appear as a soft, disembodied chorus, shadows of elders, gentle silhouettes, distant lanterns glowing in the fog, always present, never fully seen. Together, these three forces, tides, ship, whispers, create a meditation on the complexity of being human. Rather than portraying them in conflict, the documentary can present them as elements of a natural ecosystem, each necessary, each meaningful. The ID provides energy, the ego provides direction, the superego provides guidance. They move together like parts of a quiet symphony, not always harmonious, but always interconnected. In this calm poetic framing, Freud's theory becomes less a psychological blueprint and more a contemplative way of understanding ourselves. As the viewer drifts through this imagined inner world, the goal is not to persuade but to invite reflection, to show that each of us carries deep tides, steady ships, and ancient whispers within us. The unconscious in this vision is not a place of chaos or danger, but a serene, mysterious landscape beneath the surface, a realm where the stories we've forgotten still live, where emotions take shape before we name them, where the oldest parts of ourselves continue to breathe in the dark. Through this gentle meditation on Freud's map of the mind, the documentary becomes a journey inward, a quiet exploration of the forces that guide us even when we are unaware, revealing that to understand the unconscious is to see the subtle currents that make us unmistakably, beautifully human. In any story about a thinker who dared to describe the invisible, a quiet storm always gathers at the edges, and Freud was no exception. As his ideas spread through lecture halls, salons, and medical circles, they drew admiration and resistance in equal measure. Even spoken softly, his theories carried a kind of unsettling power, for they suggested that beneath every thought lay another thought, beneath every choice a hidden motive, beneath every dream a wish we did not choose. Some critics felt Freud reduced the vastness of the human spirit to too few explanations, that his interpretations were too narrow, too symbolic, too certain. Others objected to his emphasis on sexuality, not because they denied the complexity of desire, but because they thought Freud placed too much weight on it, weaving erotic themes even into childhood memories and the simplest dreams. The idea felt startling in his era, almost indecent, and even today it can be misunderstood. Freud was not trying to scandalize the world, but to argue that desire, in many forms, is a fundamental human force, one that shapes us quietly from the earliest days of life. The storms grew heavier when Freud and Carl Jung, once bound by a deep intellectual friendship, began to part ways. Freud believed the unconscious was personal, rooted in individual experience. Jung envisioned it as something larger, a collective reservoir shared by humanity. Their break was painful, a quiet unraveling of trust and affection, but was also a sign of how powerful their ideas had become. The field they were building could no longer be contained within a single worldview. It needed space to branch, to experiment, to evolve. And so the criticisms came, but not as final verdicts, more like waves reshaping a shoreline. Freud's theories would be questioned, revised, expanded, sometimes dismissed, sometimes rediscovered. Yet through it all, one truth remained. He had opened a door into the private theater of the mind, into the dream landscapes and forgotten memories and silent impulses that guide human life. Others would walk through this door differently, some with agreement, some with skepticism, some carrying their own lanterns to explore new corners of the psyche, but the threshold itself was placed by Freud. In the soft light of historical distance, the controversies lose their sharpness. What remains is the courage of a thinker who stepped into uncharted territory, who listened to the unspoken, who believed that understanding the mind required us to wander through its shadows as well as its light. Ideas change, as all living things do. But every idea begins somewhere, with someone willing to dream. And Freud's dream, messy, poetic, imperfect, helped the world imagine the mind in a new way, opening a pathway for generations of thinkers to follow, question, and transform. In the final decades of his life, Sigmund Freud experienced a profound mixture of loss, displacement, and quiet perseverance, a period marked not by the exuberance of discovery, but by the heavy shadow of history pressing upon the individual mind. Vienna, the city that had shaped him, nurtured him, and allowed his imagination to roam freely through the unseen corridors of the human psyche, was transformed into a place of fear and hostility as the Nazis rose to power. Streets that once echoed with the gentle hum of conversation and candlelit cafes became filled with the chilling hush of oppression. Friends, colleagues, and neighbors vanished or fled, cultural life shrank beneath the weight of violence and suspicion, and the intellectual salons where Freud had once walked with ease were now silenced or co-opted by forces that denied the very humanity he had spent a lifetime studying. Amid this quiet terror, Freud faced the cruel reality that the city of his youth, the city of his work, could no longer be a home. He was forced to make the painful decision to leave, to sever ties with the familiar streets, the libraries, the patience, and the quiet rhythms of Vienna that had nurtured both his spirit and his intellect. With careful planning, resourcefulness, and a mixture of relief and sorrow, he crossed borders into London, carrying with him what remained of his library, his manuscripts, and the immense mental maps he had constructed over decades of thought. In London, he found a refuge, yet it was a refuge shadowed by exile. The streets were unfamiliar, the air was heavy with the weight of displacement, and the city, though welcoming, could never fully replicate the rhythms and intimacy of Vienna. Here, the nostalgia for the home he had lost mingled with a quiet awareness that the world he had known was disappearing, that the society which had allowed his ideas to flourish had been irrevocably altered. And as if in parallel to this external upheaval, Freud's body began to betray him. The illness that had shadowed his later years deepened into pain and limitation. He underwent multiple operations, and each recovery seemed slower than the last. Simple tasks became laborious, and yet in the midst of physical fragility, the mind that had so carefully traced the hidden currents of thought, desire, and memory, remained alert, unyielding, and endlessly curious. Even as his body weakened, Freud's thoughts continued to wander through the corridors he had discovered within the human soul, exploring once more the hidden chambers of the unconscious, retracing the pathways of dreams, examining the subtle interplay between ID, ego, and superego with the precision of a mind unbound by circumstance. In these quiet, reflective years, Freud's work assumed a contemplative tone. He no longer sought fame, debate, or confrontation, but rather the steady pursuit of understanding, the patient tracing of patterns, the gentle excavation of truths buried within the human interior. London became a place of introspection rather than spectacle, a city in which he could move slowly, almost meditatively, through the landscape of his own ideas, considering each theory, each case study, each remembered insight with the care of a scholar tending a delicate garden. He wrote, he reflected, and he corresponded with colleagues, never abandoning the habit of attentive listening, never ceasing to observe the quiet movements of thought and feeling in both his patients and himself. And though the sorrow of exile and the weight of historical catastrophe pressed upon him, There was also a remarkable continuity in Freud's life. The inner journey he had begun as a young man, walking the snow-dusted streets of Vienna and tracing the currents of human desire and conflict, continued unabated within the private chambers of his mind. His thoughts flowed through these invisible corridors as freely as they had decades earlier, only now tempered by the soft melancholy of lived experience, by the knowledge of loss and mortality, by the awareness that the world of his earliest inspirations had been forever altered. In this sense, Freud's later years were not simply a period of decline. They were a time of inward expansion, a profound reflection, of the deepening of insight that comes from witnessing both the beauty and fragility of human existence. Even in exile, even in physical pain, the patient, meticulous mind that had once mapped the uncharted territory of dreams and the unconscious continued to illuminate new corners of understanding, not with the urgency of youthful ambition, but with the calm, deliberate attention of a thinker fully acquainted with both the potential and the limits of human life. The exile itself became, in a way, part of Freud's meditation. It was a lived metaphor for the tensions between desire and reality, belonging and separation, continuity and rupture that he had spent a lifetime exploring within the human psyche. His correspondence, his writings, and his private reflections from London reveal a man still attentive to the faintest stirrings of thought, still tracing the hidden influences of memory and emotion, still listening to the whispered stories carried within the unconscious. And so, though the body faltered and the world around him convulsed with cruelty and upheaval, Freud's mind remained an unbroken vessel of exploration. It drifted gently through the landscapes of the mind he had discovered, returning to earlier ideas, refining them, seeing them in new light, as a river might wind through familiar valleys yet reveal new patterns in the current. There was sadness, certainly soft, pervasive, almost tangible, but also a profound sense of continuity. The work of understanding the mind, once begun, does not end with borders, exile, or illness. Even as Vienna faded from view, even as the physical self weakened under the strain of illness, the inner journey persisted, luminous and serene, carrying forward the quiet, unending curiosity that had defined Freud's life from the beginning. In the gentle rhythm of reflection, Freud embodied the idea that the mind is not bound by circumstance, that the corridors of thought and feeling remain open to exploration even when the world outside is closed or hostile, and that the human spirit, though vulnerable, can persist in quiet observation, in patient contemplation, in the tender pursuit of understanding. His later years, then, were not merely a story of loss or decline, but a testament to the resilience of the mind, a meditation on the endurance of curiosity, and a reminder that even in the face of exile, pain, and historical tragedy, the journey of understanding, of listening, observing, and tracing the invisible currents of desire, memory, and thought continues without pause, illuminating the profound interior landscape of the human soul until the very end. Even after his death, Freud's journey through the hidden landscapes of the mind continued to ripple outward, touching realms he could never have imagined. The ideas he traced so patiently, dreams as messages, symptoms as stories, the unconscious as a living, breathing territory, found new expression not only in therapy rooms but in the arts, in literature, in cinema, in the quiet meditations of people trying to understand themselves. Writers borrowed his insights to shape characters haunted by memory, longing, and unspoken desire. Painters rendered images that seemed to float between consciousness and dream. Filmmakers traced shadowy plots where the inner lives of protagonists were revealed in symbols, silences, and sudden glimpses of truth. Even in music and theater, echoes of psychoanalysis could be felt, in the way tension, repression, and release were dramatized with subtlety, mirroring the currents Freud had once described within the human mind. And yet, it is essential to remember that Freud was not a figure to worship, nor a scientist whose theories should be accepted as immutable laws of nature. He was, above all, a storyteller, a careful, patient observer who listened to the voices beneath the surface and sought to give them form and coherence. He told stories about the human interior, tales composed of dreams, memories, desires, fears, and the strange, delicate logic that governs thought when it slips beyond conscious control. Psychoanalysis, in this sense, is less a rigid system than an invitation to attend, to explore, to recognize that there is more within us than we immediately know, and that our own interior lives are filled with poetry, symbolism, and the quiet wisdom of self-reflection. Today, in therapy, Freud's ideas continue to guide those who wish to speak their silences, to name their unspoken fears, and to understand the hidden motivations behind their actions. In art and literature, his legacy endures in works that probe the shadows, that illuminate the interior with empathy and attention. Even in film, his influence lingers in narratives where dreams, memories, and inner conflict shape the very plot itself, where the unseen architecture of the mind becomes a terrain to explore visually, emotionally, and philosophically. The reach of his work is not measured in charts, citations, or accolades, but the quiet moments it inspires, the moments when we pause to notice a recurring dream, to interpret a slip of the tongue, to feel the echo of a long-buried memory, or simply to sit with our thoughts and acknowledge their complexity. Freud's genius lay not in providing answers that are absolute, but in teaching a way of listening, a way of paying attention to the mind's subtleties, to the intricate choreography of desire and defense, of longing and inhibition that shapes human experience. And so, in this calm reflection, we can see that the dream lives on, not merely as a theoretical construct, but as a guide, as a companion, as a gentle whisper pointing toward the richness of our interior world. He taught us to listen, not to silence it, not to judge it, but to attend to it fully, to our fears, our longings, and the quiet symbols that visit us at night, carrying truths that are ours to understand if only we allow ourselves the patience and attention to do so. Through Freud's work, the night becomes less a time of confusion and more a space for insight. The unconscious ceases to be a threatening abyss and becomes a place of discovery, of poetry, of story. And in this way, the mind he mapped so tenderly continues to speak, continues to guide, continues to unfold in each new generation, inviting us all to wander, to wonder, and to listen carefully to the secret language that lives within. The journey he began, so long ago, in the quiet streets of Vienna, in the intimate space of a consulting room, in the mysterious flow of dreams, remains open, a path into the depths of ourselves that any of us may follow, softly, patiently, with curiosity and care. Freud's legacy, then, is not a monument to a single life or a collection of rigid theories, but a continuing meditation on what it means to be human, to dream, to remember, to desire, to reflect, and above all, to listen to the currents beneath the surface, to the stories we tell ourselves, and to the quiet, illuminating whispers of the mind that visit us at night. As the journey through Freud's inner landscapes comes to a close, the music softens, slow and steady like a heartbeat at rest, guiding the listener gently back toward wakefulness. The camera, or imagination, drifts upward, leaving behind the shadowed corridors of the unconscious, the hidden chambers of memory, and the delicate tides of desire, returning to the quiet surface of the mind where thought is calm and breathing is measured. The narrator speaks softly, almost as if whispering a lullaby. Tonight, as you drift into sleep, remember, the mind still speaks in symbols, and dreams still carry secrets. And perhaps, you now understand their language a little more. The words linger in the air, resonant but unhurried, giving space for reflection, for the gentle acceptance of the mysteries that reside within each of us. Slowly, the scene fades, replaced by the tactile sound of pages turning, one after another, each a small echo of the stories, the desires, and the thoughts that inhabit the mind. And as the final page settles, silence remains, not empty, but filled with the quiet knowledge that the journey is ongoing, that the language of dreams continues to unfold each night, waiting patiently for those willing to listen.